Good morning, Dame Andrea Leadsom. It's great to have you with us. Thank you for your time. What
Pleasure.
we want to talk about is the work you've been doing for the last few years, something I know you're very passionate about. So really, can you start and tell us what got you interested in the whole early years issue?
Well, it's actually rather a long story. It was about 25 years ago that I first got involved with a charity called the Oxford Parent Infant Project. And the reason for that was because my mum was a midwife and a trauma counsellor, and OXPIT was providing psychotherapeutic support for families who were struggling to form a secure bond with their baby, usually because of postnatal depression or their own early attachment status and so on. So I got involved to help that charity to raise charitable funding, and before I knew it I was chairing it, and that, the rest is history. But the reason I was sympathetic to it was because of my own brief experience of postnatal depression and just the enormity of the challenge of having a baby. And the world expects you to, number one, be utterly joyful, and number two, to just carry on, just carry on. And it's, for so many people, it just isn't like that. So I've always felt that we need to provide far more support for families who are just, even if they're not struggling. Everybody has sleepless nights and difficulties and questions, and they worry about their babies, and there is this sense in our society, well, you're back to work, don't talk to me about your baby, you just carry on and pretend nothing's happened, and of course that can't be the case.
But it's something you've been passionate about and taken that passion forward for over a quarter of a century now, so it's obviously something that really speaks to you.
Yeah.
As a mother, as a daughter, because it was through your own mother, and now as a professional campaigner.
Yes, that's right, and that is my rationale for getting involved. But actually, over the years, what I've also learnt is that it is the period from conception to the age of 2 when the whole of the human mind is developed. So human animals are unique in the animal kingdom in the extent of our underdevelopment at birth. If you think about it, when a kitten's born, it can see, it can look around, it can fend for itself, it can walk. Human babies can't do anything for themselves until they're at least a year old. And the physical underdevelopment is just a part of it. The brain is only partially formed at birth, and it's the earliest experiences, right from experiences in the womb and as a new baby, that shape your entire lifelong emotional capacity as a human being. So the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that deals with emotions and being able to regulate your own emotions, that part of the brain isn't there at birth, and it puts on a growth spurt between 6 months and 18 months, and that depends on the stimulation of a loving adult carer, and that builds your capacity as a human being.
Thank you. So you began with your relationship with OXPIT, this when you were a woman in business, you worked in finance, and then you came to Parliament in 2010, at the 2010 election. Can you tell us about your early parliamentary career, and then how you built up your work through the APPG, your cross-party work, and the 1001 Critical Days Manifesto?
Yes. Well, when I first came into Parliament, I always had what I called my 3 Bs, which was babies, banks and Brussels. And as you point out, I'd been in finance for 25 years, so even longer than I'd been working on this early years project. And so coming into Parliament just after the financial crisis, my first focus was getting onto the Treasury Select Committee, actually looking at what we should do to regulate the banks to make sure that another repeat of the financial crisis and the libel scandal and so on couldn't happen again. And then the Brussels bit, well, maybe we won't talk about that. I think that's kind of history now, but certainly looking at reform of the EU was that second B. And then the third one, babies, that was the one that I really wanted to make some progress with. And of course, here in Parliament, we have great opportunities to set up all-party parliamentary groups, which I did with the APPG on conception to the age of 2. We had some fantastic speakers come in and talk to us about how the brain develops, what different countries are doing to provide better support for the early years, and what we could do, things like offering birth registration in children's centres, things like offering better psychotherapeutic support for families, better information for families, because very often, we all know that a baby who is spoken to, who has a much bigger vocabulary than a baby whose early months and years are spent in pretty much silence, because often parents don't realise talking to your baby, even though your baby doesn't seem to understand you and certainly doesn't talk back, is an incredible way of stimulating the brain development of that baby. So for a lot of parents, they're like, what? I did not know that. Even very well educated parents themselves. So simply teaching parents, building the capacity of parents to cope with the challenge of parenting. And that was the kind of thing we did through the APPG. And that culminated in the manifesto for the 1001 critical days, which is the period from conception to the age of 2, 1001 days. And that manifesto was calling on government to do all sorts of things, from providing better support for families, more education, more interventions, domestic violence reduction, smoking cessation, better health interventions, and so on. And that manifesto has really gone from strength to strength. And there is now a movement called the First 1001 Days Movement, which is made up of loads of charities and different organisations who support better interventions in that period.
So that was interesting. That was your period, your first period as a backbencher when you entered, but very soon you were in government, and you had different roles. So what, in that beginning period in government, when you were still obviously thinking about your 3 Bs, specifically on the issue of babies, what do you think the government was getting right, and where did you think it was getting it wrong back in that period?
Yeah, so my first job was as city minister, which is slightly far removed from babies, very interesting from bank and regulation point of view, and I loved that job. But actually, the first thing to say is when you become a minister, you actually have to drop every single external interest for very good reasons. So even being chairman, as I was then, of the Parent-Infant Partnership UK, a national charity that I'd established to create these kind of psychotherapeutic services around England, I had to drop that instantly. I had to drop all of my APPG work and so on. So that was actually quite hard. And at the same time, because I was now very busy with a ministerial job, it was quite difficult to continue to take an interest in the early years stuff. So I became patron of those charities, but couldn't do very much. But the one thing I was able to do was to keep talking to members of opposition parties. And I think it's quite interesting because a lot of people, members of the public, think that, well, we must all hate each other, Labour, Conservative, we see you in the chamber arguing like crazy. But actually, far from it, I used to have some really good conversations with people like Dame Tessa Jowell, who is sadly no longer with us. But when you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and that first one, early years foundation support, that was very much influenced by the conversations that Dame Tessa Jowell was having with me and with others about the importance of the early years, and she was taking that to the UN Sustainable Goals to promote the importance of the early years there. So actually, opposition members, David Blunkett's always made very clear his absolute support for those critical early years, people like Sharon Hodgson, Lucy Powell. So actually being able to continue talking cross-party, Jo Swinson for the Lib Dems, has been a really important part of that, even as a minister. And so even when you're not allowed to spend a lot of time in your day job focusing on early years, you can still make progress behind the scenes.
Well, I remember you once saying that it was like having to do it off the side of your desk.
Yeah.
Because you were so busy with your brief.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And of course, later on, as Leader of the House, Theresa May, as Prime Minister, invited me to chair an interministerial group on early years, which was very officially off the side of my desk, but that was superb because we really did make some progress there. But once you actually are able to, if you like, command civil service resources and to set out a plan and get other ministers involved, that actually makes a big difference. And that's what now this Early Years Healthy Development Review is doing so brilliantly.
So have you seen a change in the interest of your colleagues on both sides of the House since over the last 12 years since you became a Member of Parliament?
Very much so. And I suppose in a way that's partly because of the change in makeup of parliamentarians. I think certainly on our side, on the Conservative side, there are many more women, and in particular, many more parents. So there are lots of younger men and younger women. We've had lots of pregnancies and new arrivals on our benches, as well as on the opposition benches. So, you know, as Leader of the House, I was able to introduce baby leave, which meant that MPs who prior to that would only be slipped, so allowed to not be here to vote, actually would now be able to proxy vote. So even whilst they had a very, very young baby, they would still be able to give their vote in support of their constituents, but from afar, so remotely. And that was actually quite a big win for being able to properly parent in that critical early period, whilst at the same time keeping up your job as an office holder. And yes, I would also say that a lot of colleagues who perhaps this was all a bit new to, and they were just like, oh, babies, you know, well, it's not very interesting, have actually changed their mind over that time. And now I think there's a huge groundswell of support from right across the House for doing much, much more to support the early years.
And I just want now to touch on the Early Years Healthy Development Review. So can you tell us its scope, the vision, and what you're working towards?
Yeah, so it was a specific appointment by the Prime Minister. It was soon after I was sacked from my cabinet job, so whether it was a consolation prize. But actually, Boris Johnson has always been very interested in the early years. And so even when he was Foreign Secretary or even as a backbencher, when I would raise this issue, he would be like, yes, dead right, you know, in his Boris way, this is really important. So when I said to him, can I take this work forward, he was very up for it. Yes, you definitely can. He, at the time, let Matt Hancock know that Matt should support this as Secretary of State for Health. So we pulled together a team of civil servants in the Department for Health, and with sponsoring ministers in health, in education, and in the Cabinet Office, who sort of traditionally pull Whitehall departments together. And so we kicked off phase 1 with a small team of civil servants and my own parliamentary office. And we did a huge amount of research into what do families need, what can we do to improve their experience. So we talked to lots and lots of parents and carers, early years professionals, local authorities and so on. And absolutely universal feedback was, well, I knew I was pregnant, I had no idea what I might need by way of support, and even if I had known what I might need, I wouldn't know where to find it. So actually, when it came to producing our report, this vision for the 1001 critical days, it was very much focused around putting the baby at the centre of everything we do. What does the baby and his or her family, parents and carers need to give them the best start for life? So the 6 action areas that we came up with in our vision for the 1001 days are all around making the experience better for babies and for those who care for them.
So it's the baby at the heart of it.
Absolutely, that is key to this.
So there was a commitment in the spending review.
Yeah.
How is that going to make a difference?
And that was amazing, because when we produced the report last March, so about a year ago, it actually was, the downside of it was that there was no money with it because there was no fiscal event taking place. So whilst it was a government document, we put it through right round, it got sign off, so it was now government policy. But as ever, as we know, when you're asking local authorities to change the way they do something, they will rightly say, well, who's paying for that? So actually we were feeling for some months that the ability to really enact change would be dependent on sort of winning hearts and minds and persuading people to divert funding from other places. So then when we had the spending review last October, we had put in really powerful spending review bids. The Start for Life unit put in their spending review bids, and I put in what was known as the chairman's bids, which were, let's say, even more punchy, even more demanding, and followed that up with going to see Rishi as Chancellor. And I know, because he was part of the interministerial group when he was local government minister, that he was also very keen on this and very keen to help if he could. And he did say to me, you know, it's going to be a very tight fiscal event, but I will do what I can. So yes, that spending review, effectively £500 million for that period from conception to the age of 2, is a material game changer. It now means that in asking local authorities to take up this vision, that we can actually provide the financial support for transformation to family hubs, for building a parent-infant mental health service, for souping up their breastfeeding support work, for providing much better parenting programs, to provide much better education for parents and carers, to provide a Start for Life offer. Here you are, here is the offer, this is what you can get and how to get it. And also for work to look at the way the early years workforce operates at the moment and to soup that up to provide much more capacity to provide support to families.
That's amazing. It's a real achievement, isn't it? And as you said, it's got the money behind it. And where do you think the biggest challenge lies in this process?
So there is one specific area where we need to make faster progress, and that is, as I mentioned, we've got 6 key action areas in the vision for the 1001 Days. The third one is a digital version of the Red Book, and you'll have, I should think, 3 of those.
3 of those Red Books.
Yeah, I've got 3 as well. And of course, they record the circumference of the baby's head and the birth weight and the immunisations. And you're encouraged to take them to your health visitor visits. But, you know, when you're trying to get dressed, have a shower, get the toddler breakfasted, get the baby's nappy changed, and remember the Red Book. It's the Red Book that gets forgotten every time. So most of us end up with a incomplete at best record, and many people just lose the Red Book. So what we're trying to do is to digitise that Red Book, and there we are having some significant problems. It is in fact government policy that digital version of the Red Book is rolled out for every new baby from April 2023. What it means for parents is they have a continuous record of what happens to their baby: weaning, crying, sleeping, weight gain, weight loss, immunisations, any childhood illnesses, etc., eczema, sleeping. And they can look back at that when they have subsequent babies. For the early years professionals, it's even more important because it means they have some continuity. And as we know, in the awful stories we see all too often of babies who died, 40 fractures, and it's always the case that these people didn't know that these people were also worried, and so were these people. So actually a digital record would also be an absolutely vital aspect of safeguarding, but also a means for each, whether it's the health visitor, to know that the midwife had discussed with the mum a prior stillbirth or the fact that her partner's just left her, without having to ask parents to keep telling their story over and over again. So a digital version of the Red Book would be a real boost. And unfortunately, at the moment, we're really struggling to make progress with the NHS digital services.
Which is surprising when we've all now got we all know our NHS numbers and we've got our records on our phones in terms of having a COVID pass.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, that would be a very good prototype, the COVID app, for a digital Red Book. It starts when the baby's born with a blank sheet of paper, and you gradually populate it, all with parental permission, of course. But what that would mean is that becomes that baby's lifelong health record. Brilliant, and a quick win, but sadly we don't seem to be making much progress as quickly as I would like anyway.
Well, let's hope it's all there in time for our grandchildren.
Absolutely, definitely, Seema. Yeah.
So can we think, we've spoken about central government, we've spoken about local authorities. I want to, as we come to the end of the interview, think about the role of business.
Yeah.
So where do you think businesses have, in their role as employers, what responsibilities do they have to support families who having a baby and a young child?
It's so important. And when I was Business Secretary of State, we were working very hard on an employment rights bill. And in my view, flexible workers standard absolutely solves 80-90% of the challenge for both parents. So we introduced shared parental leave, that's great. Unfortunately, too few dads are taking that. But actually, flexible worker standard enabling both parents to say, well, I'd like to take on this job and I would like to do it 3 days a week, or 5 mornings a week, or 6 mornings a week, or term time only. And for the employer to then be able to weigh up, okay, well, this person will do it 5 days a week versus this person 3 days a week and this person 2 days a week. So actually the bids would come in, and what that would do for employers is give them greater diversity. Dare I say, I think many more women would choose to come back into the workplace having had a baby if they felt they could genuinely bid to take on this senior role, perhaps as a law partner, perhaps as a, in any walk of life, senior civil servant, if they could offer to do it part-time and be taken seriously. And then at the sort of the other end of the job spectrum, I've heard from so many, particularly women who work in perhaps blue-collar jobs, perhaps in supermarkets or in call centres and so on, where they've said, well, you know, we're allowed to ask for part-time work, but if we do, we're not taken seriously, and on the sort of last in, first out, we're the ones who are considered not committed. So actually it's a bit too brave to ask to be working part-time. So at every level, you know, we saw during the COVID lockdowns that people can work flexibly, and that actually that can work to the benefit of employers as well. Lower building costs, they need less desks, they get more diversity. So I would like to see flexible work as standard.
And so that is really incumbent on businesses themselves to take the lead, not necessarily waiting for legislation, but seeing that there's a really good business case in terms of talent retention.
Absolutely right. Businesses can take the lead. I think government should legislate to put the employee able to bid for the job on whatever hours basis they want to, as opposed to the employer saying this is a 42-hour-a-week job, and then you're like, oh no, I'm not going to apply for that then. It would be better to say, this is a job, you put in your submission and tell me how many hours you're prepared to work for it.
So is there anything else you wanted to add? Anything I haven't asked you about that you particularly wanted to highlight in the work you've been doing on this?
So I think the only other thing I would say is, of course, you know, we've got money in this spending review. It's to pay for transformation in 75 upper tier local authorities in England. Well, there are 151 of them in total, and that 500 million is for the next 3 years. So obviously I want this to endure for the very, very long term through different changes of government and so on. And so one of the things we'll be doing is working very hard to ensure we evaluate all of the money that's spent and the impact that it's making, the difference it's making, so that we come to the next spending review in what's likely to be the middle of 2024. We'll have the evidence to show to Treasury this investment is incredible value for money. You know, the Treasury at the moment, the Green Book, are very good at measuring the benefits of a bridge or a road, not so good at measuring the impact of investing in the very youngest in our society. And what I intend to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt, that by investing in our youngest, you have a much more healthy, happy, emotionally secure society that as a consequence will become far more economically productive.
Dame Andrea Leadsom, thank you very much.
Thank you.